Hello, it's Robert. You can call me Bo. And welcome back to my reading and discussion on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. I have to read this novel of hers before tomorrow, and I need to give a response paper on it tomorrow. So there's 51 chapters, I believe. 61 chapters, I believe. Yep, 61. And I knocked out 5 of them last night or last morning, or this early morning. And I meant to cover 10, but I was so tired. So now we're going to cover 5 more and then end the Google Hangout. And for my benefit, because I plan to watch these back just to listen to what my thoughts are on each chapter. So, and then after these 5 chapters, I'll try to hit 10 chapters. The next 5 for the next 5, and well, last one with 11 chapters. Anyway, back to reading chapter 6 from 6 to 10. Let's go. Okie dokie. Chapter 6. The ladies of Longhorn soon waited on those of Netherfield. The visit was returned in due form. Miss Bennet's pleasing manners grew on the goodwill of Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and though the mother was found to be intolerable, and the younger sisters not worth speaking to, a wish of being better acquainted with them was expressed towards the 2 eldest. By Jane this attention was received with the greatest pleasure, but Elizabeth still saw superciliousness in their treatment of everybody, hardly excepting even her sister, and could not like them, though their kindness to Jane, such as it was, had a value as arising in all probability from the influence of their brother's admiration. It was generally evident whenever they met, that he did admire her. We're talking about Jane. And to her it was equally evident that Jane was yielding to the preference which she had begun to entertain for him from the first. And that is Mr. Bingley. And was in a way to be very much in love. But she considered with pleasure that it was not likely to be discovered by the world in general, since Jane, united with great strength of feeling, a composure of temper, and a uniform cheerfulness of manner, which would guard her from the suspicions of the impertinent. She mentioned this to her friend Miss Lucas. Of course, she mentioned Miss Lucas as Elizabeth, or Lizzie, or Eliza. It may perhaps be pleasant, replied Charlotte, that's Mrs. Lucas, to be able to impose on the public in such a case, but it is sometimes a disadvantage to be so very guarded. If a woman conceals her affection with the same skill from the object of it, she may lose the opportunity of fixing him, and it will then be but poor consolation to believe the world equally in the dark. There is so much of gratitude or vanity in almost every attachment that it is not safe to leave any to itself. We can all begin freely. A slight preference is natural enough, but there are very few of us who have heart enough to be really in love without encouragement. In 9 cases out of 10, a woman had better show more affection than she feels. Bingley likes your sister undoubtedly, but he may never do more than like her, if she does not help him on. But she does help him on, as much as her nature will allow. If I can perceive her regard for him, he must be a simpleton indeed not to discover it too. Remember, Eliza, that he does not know Jane's disposition as you do. But if a woman is partial to a man, and does not endeavor to conceal it, he must find it out. Perhaps he must, if he sees enough of her, but though Bingley and Jane meet tolerably often, it is never for many hours together, and as they always see each other in large mixed parties, it is impossible that every moment should be employed in conversing together. Jane should therefore make the most of every half hour in which she can command his attention. When she is secure of him, there will be leisure for falling in love as much as she chooses. Your plan is a good one, replied Elizabeth, where nothing is in question but the degree of being well married. And if I were determined to get a rich husband, or any husband, I dare say I should adopt it. But these are not Jane's feelings. She is not acting by design. As yet, she cannot even be certain of the degree of her own regard, nor of its reasonableness. She has known him only a fortnight. She danced 4 dances with him at Meryton. She saw him one morning at his own house, and has since dined in company with him 4 times. This is not quite enough to make her understand his character. Not as you represent it. Had she merely dined with him, she might only have discovered whether he had a good appetite. But you must remember that 4 evenings have been also spent together, and 4 evenings may do a great deal. Yes, these 4 evenings have enabled them to ascertain that they both like vin en. That's, I guess, what un deux trois quatre cinq cinq we at 8-1. Both like vin en better than commerce, but with respect to any other leading characteristic, I do not imagine that much has been unfolded. Well, said Charlotte, I wish Jane success with all my heart, and if she were married to him tomorrow, I should think she had as good a chance of happiness as if she were to be studying his character for a 12-month. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. If the dispositions of the parties are ever so well known to each other, or ever so similar beforehand, it does not advance their felicity in the least. They always continue to grow sufficiently unlike afterwards to have their share of vexation. And it is better to know as little as possible of the defects of the person with whom you are to pass your life. You make me laugh, Charlotte, but it is not sound. You know it is not sound, and that you would never act in this way yourself. Occupied in observing Mr. Bingley's attentions to her sister, Elizabeth was far from suspecting that she was herself becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend, Mr. Darcy. Eyes of his friend, period. Opens a new sentence. Right. Mr. Darcy had at first scarcely allowed her to be pretty. He had looked at her without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticize. But no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she had hardly a good feature in her face, than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. To this discovery succeeded some others equally mortifying. Though he had detected with a critical eye more than one failure of perfect symmetry in her form, he was forced to acknowledge her figure to be light and pleasing, and in spite of his asserting that her manners were not those of the fashionable world, he was caught by their easy playfulness. Of this she was perfectly unaware. To her he was only the man who made himself agreeable nowhere, and who had not thought her handsome enough to dance with. He began to wish to know more of her, and as a step towards conversing with her himself, attended to her conversation with others. His doing so drew her notice. It was at Sir William Lucas's, where a large party were assembled. "What does Mr. Darcy mean," she said to Charlotte, "by listening to my conversation with Colonel Forster?" That is a question which Mr. Darcy can only answer, but if he does it any more, I shall certainly let him know that I see what he is about. He has a very satirical eye, and if I do not begin my being impertinent myself, I shall soon grow afraid of him. On his approaching them soon afterwards, though without seeming to have any intention of speaking, Miss Lucas defied her friend to mention such a subject to him, which immediately provoking Elizabeth to do it, she turned to him and said, "Did you not think, Mr. Darcy, that I expressed myself uncommonly well just now, when I was teasing Colonel Forster to give us a ball at Meryton?" "With great energy, but it is a subject which always makes a lady energetic." "You are severe on us. It will be her turn soon to be teased," said Miss Lucas. "I am going to open the instrument, Eliza, and you know what follows." "You are a very strange creature by way of a friend, always wanting me to play and sing before anybody and everybody. If my vanity had taken a musical turn, you would have been invaluable. But as it is, I would really rather not sit down before those who must be in the habit of hearing the very best performers." On Miss Lucas's persevering, however, she added, "Very well, if it must be so, it must," and gravely glancing at Mr. Darcy. "There is a fine old saying which everybody here is of course familiar with: 'Keep your breath to cool your porridge,' and I shall keep mine to swell my song." Her performance was pleasing, though by no means capital. After a song or two, before she could reply to the entreaties of several that she would sing again, she was eagerly succeeded at the instrument by her sister Mary, who, having, in consequence of being the only plain one in the family, worked hard for knowledge and accomplishments, was always impatient for display. Mary had neither genius nor taste, and though vanity had given her application, it had given her likewise a pedantic air and a conceited manner, which would have injured a higher degree of excellence than she had reached. Elizabeth, easy and unaffected, had been listened to with much more pleasure, and though not playing half so well, and Mary, at the end of a long concerto, was glad to purchase praise and gratitude by Scotch and Irish airs, at the request of her younger sisters, who, with some of the Lucases and 2 or 3 officers, joined eagerly in dancing at one end of the room. Mr. Darcy stood near them in silent indignation at such a mode of passing the evening, to the exclusion of all conversation, and was too much engrossed by his own thoughts to perceive that Sir William Lucas was his neighbour, till Sir William thus began: "What a charming amusement for young people this is, Mr. Darcy. There is nothing like dancing, after all. I consider it as one of the first refinements of polished societies." "Certainly, sir, and it has the advantage also of being in vogue amongst the less polished societies of the world. Every savage can dance." Sir William only smiled. "Your friend performs delightfully," he continued after a pause, on seeing Bingley join the group, "and I doubt not that you are an adept in the science yourself, Mr. Darcy. Excuse me. Hey, Ricky!
Yeah?
Check the frickin' heater and make sure it's not on. Feels hot up here. Is it on? What?
Yeah.
Turn it off.
What is off?
It's flippin' bloody 77 or 80 something degrees in here. Well, it's still going.
I know, it takes a few minutes before it goes off.
Lower the thermostat to 72. Jesus Christ. Mom's gonna kill us in here. All the freaking heat. On a hot day. Okay, back. You saw me dance at Meryton, I believe, sir. Yes, indeed, and received no inconsiderable pleasure from the sight. Do you often dance at St. James's? Never, sir. Do you not think it would be a proper compliment to the place? It is a compliment which I never pay to any place if I can avoid it. You have a house in town, I conclude. Mr. Darcy bowed. Yeah. I had once some thoughts of fixing in town myself, for I am fond of superior society, but I did not feel quite certain that the air of London would agree with Lady Lucas. He paused in hopes of an answer, but his companion was not disposed to make any, and Elizabeth, at that instant, moving towards them, he was struck with the notion of doing a very gallant thing, and called out to her, "My dear Miss Eliza, why are not you dancing? Mr. Darcy, you must allow me to present this young lady to you as a very desirable partner. You cannot refuse to dance, I am sure, when so much beauty is before you." And taking her hand, he would have given it to Mr. Darcy, who, though extremely surprised, was not unwilling to receive it, when she instantly drew back and said with some discomposure to Sir William, "Indeed, sir, I have not the least intention of dancing. I entreat you not to suppose that I moved this way in order to beg for a partner." Mr. Darcy, with grave propriety, requested to be allowed the honor of her hand, but in vain. Elizabeth was determined, nor did Sir William at all shake her purpose by his attempt at persuasion. "You excel so much in the dance, Miss Eliza, that it is cruel to deny me the happiness of seeing you. And though this gentleman dislikes the amusement in general, he can have no objection, I am sure, to oblige us for 1/2 hour." "Mr. Darcy is all politeness," said Elizabeth, smiling. "He is indeed, but considering the inducement, my dear Miss Eliza, we cannot wonder at his complaisance, for who would object to such a partner?" Elizabeth looked archly, and turned away. Her resistance had not injured her with the gentleman, and he was thinking of her with some complacency when thus accosted by Miss Bingley. I can guess the subject of your reverie." "I should imagine not. You are considering how insupportable it would be to pass many evenings in this manner, in such society, and indeed I am quite of your opinion. I was never more annoyed. The insipidity, and yet the noise, the nothingness, and yet the self-importance of all these people. What would I give to hear your strictures on them?" "Your conjecture is totally wrong, I assure you. My mind was more agreeably engaged. I have been meditating on the very great pleasure which a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow." Well, okay for Mr. Darcy. Checking out the Elizabeth. Miss Bingley immediately fixed her eyes on his face, and desired he would tell her what lady had the credit of inspiring such reflections. Mr. Darcy replied with great intrepidity, "Miss Elizabeth Bennet." "Miss Elizabeth Bennet," replied Miss Bingley, I am all astonishment. How long has she been such a favourite? And pray when am I to wish you joy?" "That is exactly the question which I expected you to ask. A lady's imagination is very rapid. It jumps from admiration to love, from love to matrimony in a moment. I knew you would be wishing me joy. Nay, if you are so serious about it, I shall consider the matter as absolutely settled. You will have a charming mother-in-law indeed, and of course she will always be at Pemberley with you." He listened to her with perfect indifference, while she chose to entertain herself in this manner, and as his composure convinced her that all was safe, her wit flowed long. Conclusion of chapter 6. Oh, let me take a break. It's a few pages. So, recap. Sorry about, oh god, I hope that song is in the public domain. The flippin' bloody popsicle guy is passing by with that stupid song. Oh god. I could just see this whole hangout go to pot now. Thanks, popsicle guy. Drug dealer. Okay. So, the chapter 6 recap. Ladies got together. To visit each other and talk about the ball. Oh no, wait a minute. I don't know, my mind is fried. Something about Elizabeth going to Mrs. Lucas, Mrs. Lucas for advice because she doesn't. Elizabeth does not trust Bingley's sisters, who seem quite shallow and not caring about the people they're in the company with. And Charlotte Lucas tells Elizabeth that, if her sister Jean or Joan or whatever her name is, Jane, likes Bingley, she had better show some like. She had better show some like, or else she might lose him. And they talk about how the two of them, Bingley and Jane, are seen together in various locations in a type of courting situation, and I guess both are a bit reserved, and Elizabeth wants to help her sister flesh out her deep liking for said dude, Bingley. Then talking about Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy starts to show a likeness or a fondness for Elizabeth because she's lively and he's not, and he's encouraged by Mr. Lucas to check her out. Let's go dance, And one of those sisters of Bingley goes up to Darcy and says, "What's up?" And not Lucas, but Darcy informs the sister of Bingley that he's checking out some lady who's caught his interest, and that lady is Elizabeth. And Elizabeth kind of turns away from him a bit. Mary comes into the picture, liking to perform because the author says Mary's plain, so Mary has to make up for her plainness with a pedantic air, open quote, pedantic air and conceited manner, close quote. But Elizabeth was easy and unaffected, says the book, says the author. And Mr. Darcy starts to take notice of Elizabeth as encouraged by Mr. Lucas. And Mr. Lucas tries to get the two of them to dance. Unsuccessfully, I see. And they didn't, so that concludes chapter 6. Moving on to chapter 7. I'm making myself so tired, girl. It's light outside. I need air. And chapter 7. Let's see how long chapter 7 is. 2 pages. My God, so much. Chapter 7. I like my fingers. I wish my hands were longer. Okay. Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of $2,000 a year, which unfortunately for his daughters was entailed in default of heirs male on a distant relation and their mother's fortune. Though ample for her situation in life, but could but ill supply the deficiencies of his. Her father had been an attorney in Meryton, and had left her £4,000. She had a sister married to Mr. Phillips, who had been a clerk to their father and succeeded him in the business, and a brother settled in London with a respectable line of trade. The village of Longhorn was only 1 mile from Meryton, a most convenient distance for the young ladies, who were usually tempted thither 3 or 4 times a week to pay their duty to their aunt and to a milliner's shop. A millinery is a hat shop. The 2 youngest of the family, Catherine and Lydia, were particularly frequent in these attentions. Their minds were more vacant than their sisters'. Funny. And when nothing better offered, a walk to Meryton was necessary to amuse their morning hours and furnish conversation for the evening. And however bare of news the country in general might be, they always contrived to learn some from their aunt. At present, indeed, they were well supplied both with news and happiness by the recent arrival of a militia regiment in the neighborhood. It was to remain the whole winter, and Meryton was the headquarters. Their visits to Mrs. Phillips were now productive of the most interesting intelligence. Every day added something to their knowledge of the officers' names and connections. Their lodgings were not long a secret, and at length they began to know the officers themselves. Mr. Phillips visited them all, and this opened to his nieces a source of felicity unknown before. They could talk of nothing but officers, and Mr. Bingley's large fortune, the mention of which gave animation to their mother, was worthless in their eyes when opposed to the regimentals of an ensign. Ensign is, I guess, the first year, is it Navy? An ensign is like a freshman or first year a soldier, and I forget in what armed force is. Maybe the Army. Could be the Navy. So in other words, they'd stop talking about the money if a hot guy came by. After listening one morning to their effusions on this subject, Mr. Bennet coolly observed, "From all that I can collect by your manner of talking, you must be the two of the silliest girls in the country. I have suspected it some time, but I am now convinced." Catherine was disconcerted and made no answer, but Lydia, with perfect indifference, continued to express her admiration of Captain Carter. And her hope of seeing him in the course of the day, as he was going the next morning to London. "I am astonished, my dear," said Mrs. Bennet, "that you should be so ready to think of your own children silly. If I wished to think slightingly of anybody's children, it should not be of my own, however. If my children are silly, I must hope to be always sensible of it. Yes, but as it happens, they are all of them very clever. This is the only point, I flatter myself, on which we do not agree. I had hoped that our sentiments coincided in every particular, but I must so far differ from you as to think our two youngest daughters uncommonly foolish. My dear Mr. Bennet, you must not expect such girls to have the sense of their father and mother. When they get to our age, I dare say they will not think about officers any more than we do. I remember the time when I liked a red coat myself very well, and indeed so I do still at my heart. And if a smart young colonel with 5,000 or 6,000 a year should want one of my girls, I shall not say nay to him, and I thought Colonel Forster looked very becoming the other night at Sir William's in his regimentals." "Mamma," cried Lydia, "my aunt says that Colonel Forster and Captain Carter do not go so often to Miss Watson's as they did when they first came. She sees them now very often standing in Clark's library." Mrs. Bennet was prevented replying by the entrance of the footman with a note for Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and the servant waited for an answer. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled with pleasure, and she was eagerly calling out while her daughter read. Netherfield, of course, is where the Mr. Bingley lives. "Well, Jane, who is it from? What is it about? What does he say? Well, Jane, make haste and tell us. Make haste, my love." "It is from Miss Bingley," said Jane, and then read it aloud. "My dear friend, if you are not so compassionate as to dine today with Louisa and me, we shall be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives. For a whole day's tete-a-tete tete-a-tete means face-to-face, between two women can never end without a quarrel. Come as soon as you can on the receipt of this. My brother and the gentlemen are to dine with the officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley." So now we know there's a Caroline and a Louisa Bingley, the sisters of Mr. Bingley. "With the officers," cried Lydia. "I wonder my aunt did not tell us of that." "Dining out," said Mrs. Bennet. "That is very unlucky." "Can I have the carriage?" said Jane. "No, my dear, you had better go on horseback, because it seems likely to rain, and then you must stay all night." "That would be a good scheme," said Elizabeth, "if you were sure that they would not offer to send her home." "Oh, but the gentlemen will have Mr. Bingley's chaise to go to Meryton, and the Hursts have no horses to theirs." So I guess a chaise is some type of carriage for people to ride in as horses draw them. But, my dear, your father cannot spare the horses, I am sure. They are wanted in the farm. Mr. Bennet, are they not? They are wanted in the farm much oftener than I can get them. But if you have got them today, said Elizabeth, my mother's purpose will be answered. I'm sorry, not reading better. It's just that I have to look down to read and looking up over here, and the light's not very good. She did at last extort from her father an acknowledgment that the horses were engaged. Jane was therefore obliged to go on horseback, and her mother attended her to the door with many cheerful prognostics of a bad day. Her hopes were answered. Jane had not been gone long before it rained hard. Her sisters were uneasy for her, but her mother was delighted. The rain continued the whole evening without intermission. Jane certainly could not come back. This was a lucky idea of mine indeed, said Mrs. Bennet more than once, as if the credit of making it rain were all her own. Till the next morning, however, she was not aware of all the felicity of her contrivance. Breakfast was scarcely over when a servant from Netherfield brought the following note for Elizabeth. My dearest Lizzie, I find myself very unwell this morning, which I suppose is to be imputed to my getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of my returning home till I am better. They insist also on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore, do not be alarmed if you should hear of having been to me, and excepting a sore throat and headache, there is not much the matter with me. Yours and company. I don't know who they're talking about. I guess the sister, Jane. Well, my dear, said Mr. Bennet, when Elizabeth had read the note aloud, if your daughter should have a dangerous fit of illness, if she should die, it would be a comfort to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley and under your orders. Ouch. Oh, I am not at all afraid of her dying. People do not die of little trifling colds. She will be taken good care of. As long as she stays there, it is all very well. I would go and see her if I could have the carriage. Elizabeth, feeling really anxious, was determined to go to her, though the carriage was not to be had, and as she was no horsewoman, walking was her only alternative. She declared her resolution. How can you be so silly, cried her mother, as to think of such a thing? In all this dirt, you will not be fit to be seen when you get there. I shall be very fit to see Jane, which is all I want. Is this a hint to me, Lizzie, said her father, to send for the horses? No, indeed, I do not wish to avoid the walk. The distance is nothing. When one has a motive, only 3 miles, I shall be back by dinner. I admire the activity of your benevolence, observed Mary, but every impulse of feeling should be guided by reason, and in my opinion, exertion should always be in proportion to what is required. We will go as far as Meryton with you, said Catherine and Lydia. Elizabeth accepted their company, and the 3 young ladies set off together. If we make haste, said Lydia, as they walked along, perhaps we may see something of Captain Carter before he goes. In Meryton they parted. The 2 youngest repaired to the lodgings of one of the officers' wives, and Elizabeth continued her walk alone, crossing field after field at a quick pace, jumping over stiles and springing over puddles with impatient activity, and finding herself at last within view of the house, with weary ankles, dirty stockings, and a face glowing with the warmth of exercise. I like that. face glowing with the warmth of exercise. She was shewn into the breakfast parlor, where all but Jane were assembled, and where her appearance created a great deal of surprise. That she should have walked 3 miles so early in the day in such dirty weather, and by herself, was almost incredible to Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. And Elizabeth was convinced that they held her in contempt for it. She was received, however, very politely by them, and in their brother's manners there was something better than politeness. There was good humour and kindness. Mr. Darcy said very little, and Mr. Hurst nothing at all. The former, Mr. Darcy, was divided between admiration of the brilliancy which exercise had given to her complexion, and doubt as to the occasions justifying her coming so far alone. The latter was thinking only of his breakfast. Mr. Hurst. Her enquiries after her sister were not very favourably answered. Miss Bennet had slept ill, and though up, was very feverish and not well enough to leave her room. Elizabeth was glad to be taken to her immediately, and Jane, who had only been withheld by the fear of giving alarm or inconvenience from expressing in her note how much she longed for such a visit, was delighted at her entrance. She was not equal, however, to much conversation, and when Miss Bingley left them together, could attempt little beside expressions of gratitude for the extraordinary kindness which she was treated with. Elizabeth silently attended her. When breakfast was over, they were joined by the sisters, and Elizabeth began to like them herself, when she saw how much affection and solicitude they shewed for Jane. The apothecary came, that's a druggist, and having examined his patient, said, as might be supposed, that she had caught a violent cold, and that they must endeavour to get the better of it, advised her to return to bed, and promised her some draughts. The advice was followed readily, for the feverish symptoms increased, and her head ached acutely. Elizabeth did not quit her room for a moment, nor were the other ladies often absent. The gentlemen being out, they had in fact nothing to do elsewhere. When the clock struck 3, Elizabeth felt that she must go, and very unwillingly said so. Miss Bingley offered her the carriage, and she only wanted a little pressing to accept it. When Jane testified such concern in parting with her that Miss Bingley was obliged to convert the offer of the chaise into an invitation to remain at Netherfield for the present, Elizabeth most thankfully consented, and a servant was dispatched to Longbourn to acquaint the family with her stay, and bring back a supply of clothes. Conclusion of Chapter 7. Oh my god, I'm so tired already, as if I wrote... let me put the air conditioner on. I can't take this. I'm sorry if it's loud. Hope it's not a nuisance to the recording. Recapitulation of Chapter 7. Mr. Bennet's Chapter 7 opens with a discussion of Mr. Bennet's property and how much stuff he had for his girls as dowry. He had been an attorney in Meryton. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah. She had a sister married to Mr. Phillips. That's the mother's father, not Mr. Bennet. So Elizabeth's aunt, Mr. Phillips, or Mrs. Phillips, lived just outside Meryton, and the girls, Catherine and Lydia, like to go visit on their airheads, and they like to go look at the men, military men, and go say hi to Mrs. Phillips, check out the officers, and when they were home and talking about it, their dad was trying to make short shrift of, or to talk down the importance of the men that they were talking about. The girls, Catherine and Lydia, that is, and their mom said, you know, hey, when I was young, I liked them too. And when they get to be our age, they're not going to act like that anymore. And up came someone from the Netherfield, from Bingley's house, and invited Jane to dinner. But it was not Mr. Bingley, it was the sisters, Louisa and Caroline. Jane went. Jane got sick. She took the horse, as far as I know. It started to rain, and the mother pressed her daughter to go. She wants to marry him off. Jane got sick, sent a letter home. I don't know why she sent the letter. Jane sent the letter to Lizzie instead of her mother or her father. The dad said, well, okay, Mother Bennet, if our daughter dies, this is on you. You're the one who sent her to whatever that place was, that dude's house to chill with his sisters. And Mary chimes in, you know, use your reason, not your heart. But Elizabeth decides to go see her sister Mary, or her sister Jane, and Catherine and Lydia say they'll tag along. They'll go check out other things, and Meryton can, or you know, sister can check out stuff at Bingham's house. To see her sister, Jane, get well. Yes. And there, Mr. Darcy was like, you know, Elizabeth looks pretty high from that exercise workout coming here. And Mr. Hurst was like, I want my breakfast. And Elizabeth attended to Jane. Jane was so happy to see her sister, Elizabeth. The other sisters, you know, Bingley's sisters were helping out too, so that made Elizabeth like them a whole lot more than what she already did. And although it was time for Elizabeth to go, she was happy to accept the invitation to stay at Netherfield to continue to service and take care of her sister Elizabeth, and sent somebody to go tell Mom and Dad that she's going to stay at Netherfield. I cannot. That's the conclusion of chapter 7. I am so tired. Oh my God. 23. Let's see how much this is. 2 pages left. Maybe I should just like speed through this and check it out later. Oh my God. Yeah. I think that I'd have a much easier time if I could look up at the paper, but my glasses are not such that they're strong enough to see, and I need a whole lot more light. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Too bad I can't fix the light in this fashion. So, let's see. There's only like 3 more chapters to go for this set of 5. I think for the next 10, I'm just going to speed read right through each of them. And, let's see what happens with that. What can you do? I wish there was a timer in here to let me know how long I've been on. 6:34. I wonder if anything good is playing tonight. I am so tired, but I have to read this stuff. Potty break. Just kidding. Chapter 8. At 5 o'clock, the 2 ladies retired to dress. And at 6:30, Elizabeth was summoned to dinner. To the civil inquiries which then poured in, and amongst which she had the pleasure of distinguishing the much superior solicitude of Mr. Bingley's, she could not make a very favourable answer. Jane was by no means better. The sisters, on hearing this, repeated 3 or 4 times how much they were grieved, how shocking it was to have had a bad cold, and how excessively they disliked being ill themselves, and then thought no more of the matter, and their indifference towards Jane, when not immediately before them, restored Elizabeth to the enjoyment of all her original dislike. I guess. Their brother, indeed, was the only one of the party whom she could regard with any complacency. His anxiety for Jane was evident, and his attentions to herself most pleasing, and they prevented her feeling herself so much an intruder as she believed she was considered by the others. She had very little notice from any but him. Miss Bingley was engrossed by Mr. Darcy, and her sister scarcely less so. As for Mr. Hurst, by whom Elizabeth sat, he was an indolent man, who lived only to eat, drink, and play at cards, who, when he found her prefer a plain dish to a ragout, had nothing to say to her. I'm assuming that's a ragout. French for ragout. When dinner was over, she returned directly to Jane, and Miss Bingley began abusing her as soon as she was out of the room. Her manners were pronounced to be very bad indeed, a mixture of pride and impertinence. She had no conversation, no style, no taste, no beauty. Mrs. Hurst thought the same, and added, "She has nothing, in short, to recommend her, but being an excellent walker. I shall never forget her appearance this morning. She really almost looked wild." "She did indeed, Louisa. I could hardly keep my countenance." "Very nonsensical to come at all. Why must she be scampering about the country because her sister had a cold? Her hair so untidy, her blouse so lousy. Yes, and her petticoat. I hope you saw her petticoat, 6 inches deep in mud. I am absolutely certain, and the gown which she had been let down to hide it, not doing its office, its duty." "Your picture may be very exact, Louisa," said Bingley, "but this was all lost upon me. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she came into the room this morning. Her dirty petticoat quite escaped my notice." "You observed it, Mr. Darcy, I am sure," said Miss Bingley, "and I am inclined to think that you would not wish to see your sister make such an exhibition." "Certainly not. to walk 3 miles or 4 miles or 5 miles or whatever it is above her ankles in dirt and alone, quite alone. What could she mean by it? It seems to me to shew an abominable sort of conceited independence, most country town indifference to decorum. It shews an affection for her sister that is very pleasing, said Bingley. I am afraid, Mr. Darcy, observed Mrs. Bingley, in half a whisper, that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes. Not at all, he replied. They were brightened by the exercise. A short pause followed this speech, and Mrs. Hurst began again. I have excessive regard for Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart she were well settled. But with such a father and mother, and such low connections, I am afraid there is no chance of it. I think I have heard you say that their uncle is an attorney in Meryton. Yes, and they have another who lives somewhere near Cheapside. That is capital, added her sister. Sounds like that's bitchin'. That is capital, added her sister, and they both laughed heartily. If they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside, cried Bingley, it would not make them one jot less agreeable. But it must materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world, replied Darcy. To this speech, Bingley made no answer. But his sisters gave it their hearty assent, and indulged their mirth for some time at the expense of their dear friend's vulgar relations. With a renewal of tenderness, however, they repaired to her room on leaving the dinner parlour, and sat with her till summoned to coffee. She was still very poorly, and Elizabeth would not quit her at all till late in the evening, when she had the comfort of seeing her asleep, and when it appeared to her rather right than pleasant that she should go downstairs herself. On entering the drawing-room, she found the whole party at loo, and was immediately invited to join them, but suspecting them to be playing high, she declined it, and making her sister the excuse, said she would amuse herself for the short time she could stay below with a book. Mr. Hurst looked at her with astonishment. Do you prefer reading to cards? said he. That is rather singular. Miss Eliza Bennet, said Mrs. Bingley, despises cards. Miss Eliza Bennet despises cards. She is a great reader and has no pleasure in anything else. I deserve neither such praise nor such censure, cried Elizabeth. I am not a great reader, and I have pleasure in many things. In nursing your sister, I am sure you have pleasure, said Bingley, and I hope it will soon be increased by seeing her quite well. Elizabeth thanked him. I can't believe I almost fell asleep. In nursing your sister, I am sure you have pleasure, said Bingley, and I hope it will soon be increased by seeing her quite well. Elizabeth thanked him from her heart, and then walked towards a table where a few books were lying. He immediately offered to fetch her others, all that his library afforded. And I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and my own credit, but I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I ever look into. Elizabeth assured him that she could suit herself perfectly with those in the room. I am astonished, said Miss Bingley, that my father should have left so small a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy. It ought to be good, he replied. It has been the work of many generations, and then you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books. I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these. Neglect? I am sure you neglect nothing that can add to the beauties of that noble place. Charles, when you build your house, I wish it may be as half as delightful as Pemberley. I wish it may. But I would really advise you to make your purchase in that neighborhood, and take Pemberley for a kind of model. There is not a finer county in England than Derbyshire, or Derbyshire. Derbyshire. With all my heart, I will buy Pemberley itself if Darcy will sell it. I am talking of possibilities, Charles. Upon my word, Caroline, I should think it more possible to get Pemberley by purchase than by imitation. Elizabeth was so much caught by what passed as to leave her very little attention for her book, and soon laying it wholly aside, she drew near the card table and stationed herself between Mr. Bingley and his eldest sister to observe the game. Is Miss Darcy much grown since the spring? Said Miss Bingley. Will she be as tall as I am? I think she will. She is now about Miss Elizabeth Bennet's height, or rather taller. How long to see her again? I never met with anybody who delighted me so much. Such a countenance, such manners, and so extremely accomplished for her age. Her performance on the pianoforte is exquisite. It is amazing to me, said Bingley, how young ladies can have patience to be so very accomplished as they are. All young ladies accomplished. My dear Charles, what do you mean? Yes, all of them, I think. They all paint tables, cover screens, and net purses. I scarcely know anyone who cannot do all this, and I am sure I never heard a young lady spoken of for the first time without being informed that she was very accomplished. Your list of the common extent of accomplishments, said Darcy, has too much truth. The word is applied to many a woman who deserves it, no otherwise than by netting a purse or covering a screen. But I am very far from agreeing with you in your enthusiasm, in your estimation of ladies in general. I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen in the whole range of my acquaintance that are really accomplished. Nor I am sure, said Miss Bingley. Then, observed Elizabeth, you must comprehend a great deal of your idea of an accomplished woman. Yes, I do comprehend a great deal in it. Oh, certainly, cried his faithful assistant. No one can be really esteemed accomplished who does not greatly surpass what is unusually met with. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word, and besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved. All this must possess, added Darcy. All this she must possess, added Darcy, and to all this she must yet add something more substantial, in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now at your knowing any. Are you so severe upon your own sex as to doubt the possibility of all this? I never saw such a woman. I never saw such capacity and taste and application and elegance as you describe, united. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley both cried out against the injustice of her implied doubt, and were both protesting that they knew many women who answered this description, when Mr. Hurst called them to order, with bitter complaints of their inattention to what was going forward. As all conversation was thereby at an end, Elizabeth soon afterwards left the room. Eliza Bennet, said Miss Bingley, when the door was closed on her, is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own with many men. I dare say it succeeds. but in my opinion it is a paltry device, a very mean art. Undoubtedly, replied Darcy, to whom this remark was chiefly addressed, there is meanness in all the arts, which ladies sometimes condescend to employ for captivation. Whatever beats affinity to cunning is despicable. Miss Bingley was not so entirely satisfied with this reply as to continue the subject. Elizabeth joined them again, only to say that her sister was worse, and that she could not leave her. Bingley urged Mr. Jones being sent for immediately. While her sister convinced that no country advice could be of any service, while his sister is convinced that no country advice could be of any service, recommended and expressed to town for one of the most eminent physicians. This she would not hear of, but she was not so unwilling to comply with their brother's proposal. And it was settled that Mr. Jones should be sent for early in the morning. If Miss Bennet were not decidedly better, Bingley was quite uncomfortable. New sense. Bingley was quite uncomfortable. His sister just declared that they were miserable. They solaced their wretchedness, however, by duets after supper, which he could find no better relief to his feelings than by giving his housekeeper directions that every possible attention might be paid to the sick lady and her sister. End of chapter 8. Recapitulation. It was like in the early evening, late afternoon, and Elizabeth was called to dinner. And by the behavioral patterns of the sisters of Mr. Bingley, Elizabeth took a dislike to them once again, renewed her dislike, and she noted that Mr. Darcy who she thought was a rude man who just lived to eat, drink, and play cards. And when dinner was over, she went back to her sister Jane, and the sisters, Mrs. Bingley and Mrs. No, I'm not. I am kind of sort of. Or Louisa and Caroline. I'm studying. I'm studying. Don't ever go to college like me. Go to community college because that's what you get. I don't know. I love my mom. I don't care if she interrupts me. So the sisters are, ragging on, dissing upon, what's her name? Eliza. And Mr. Darcy said that, he digs what she did. He digs what Eliza did, came out to take care of her sister, and that exercise to the house, their house made Eliza look pretty hot. The sisters just kept on ragging on Elizabeth, and about Elizabeth and her family's associations, lack of associations, and Elizabeth comes back into the room where showed a library to read a book or something, since she didn't want to play cards with everybody. And the sisters just try to get into Mr. Darby's pants, flirting with them. Or one of them does, anyway. Doesn't work because he still likes Elizabeth. And even though Elizabeth was reading, her attention grew weary of the books because she was listening to the conversation of the people in the next room. And Bingley and takes note that sometimes women can be patient to be accomplished, and he's astounded by it because he's normally not seeing women who are patient. And the ladies are trying to gloat. Not gloat, but the ladies are trying to groom the men into believing there is a certain type of woman that is the ideal above all ideals, and that Elizabeth is not one of them. But the guys are onto them, and they disagree with the ladies. Elizabeth comes back to the room and says that her sister is getting worse. Mr. Bingley calls for a doctor in the morning, Dr. Jones, Mr. Jones in the morning, and which is, I guess, at that time right away. And he says to his manservant, his servant, make sure that Miss Bennet, Miss Jane Bennet, and her sister Elizabeth are looked after well, and stuff. And that's the conclusion, and that's the recapitulation of Chapter 8. Chapter 9, I have to go to the bathroom, but I'll try to hold it. I think I'm going to speed through Chapter 9 and 10 and recapitulate on my own. You can kind of hear the readings and go from there. Chapter 9. Elizabeth passed the chief of the night in her sister's room, and in the morning had the pleasure of being able to send a tolerable answer to the inquiries which she very early received from Mr. Bingley by a housemaid, and some time afterwards from the two elegant ladies who waited on his sisters. In spite of this amendment, however, she requested to have a note sent to Longbourn, desiring her mother to visit Jane and form her own judgment of her situation. The note was immediately dispatched, and its contents as quickly complied with. Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her two youngest girls, reached Netherfield soon after the family breakfast. Had she found Jane in any apparent danger, Mrs. Bennet would have been very miserable, but being satisfied on seeing her that her illness was not alarming, she had no wish of her recovering immediately, as her restoration to health would probably remove her from Netherfield. Some mother. She would not listen, therefore, to her daughter's proposal of being carried home. Neither did the apothecary, who arrived about the same time, think it at all advisable. After sitting a little while with Jane on Miss Bingley's appearance and invitation, the mother and three daughters all attended to her into the breakfast parlor. Bingley met them with hopes that Mrs. Bennet had not found Miss Bennet worse than she expected. Indeed I have, sir, was her answer. She is a great deal too ill to be moved. Mr. Jones says we must not think of moving her. We must trespass a little longer on your kindness. Removed, cried Bingley. It must not be thought of. My sister, I am sure, will not hear of her removal. You may depend upon it, madam, said Miss Bingley, with cold civility, that Miss Bennet shall receive every possible attention while she remains with us. Miss Bennet was profuse in her acknowledgments. I am sure, she added, if it was not for such good friends, I do not know what would become of her, for she is very ill indeed, and suffers a vast deal, though with the greatest patience in the world, which is always the way with her, for she has, without exception, the sweetest temper I ever met with. I often tell my other girls they are nothing to her. You have a sweet room here, Mr. Bingley, and a charming prospect over that gravel walk. I do not know a place in the country that is equal to Netherfield. You will not think of quitting it in a hurry, I hope, though you have but a short lease. Whatever I do is done in a hurry, replied he, and therefore, if I should resolve to quit Netherfield, I should probably be off in 5 minutes. At present, however, I consider myself as quite fixed here. That is exactly what I should have supposed of you, said Elizabeth. You begin to comprehend me, do you? Cried he, turning towards her. Oh, yes, I understand you perfectly. I wish I might take this for a compliment, but to be so easily seen through, I am afraid, is pitiful. That is as it happens. It does not necessarily follow that a deep, intricate character is more or less estimable than such a one as yours. Lizzie, cried her mother, remember where you are, and do not run on in the wild manner that you are suffered to do at home. I did not know before, continued Bingley immediately, that you were a studier of character. It must be an amusing study. Yes, but intricate characters are the most amusing. They have at least that advantage. The country, said Darcy, can in general supply but few subjects for such a study. In a country neighborhood you move in a very confined and unvarying society, but people themselves alter so much that there is something new to be observed in them forever. Yes, indeed, cried Mrs. Bennet, offended by his manner of mentioning a country neighborhood. Yeah, because she lives in the country. There's not many people in her country neighborhood except her family. I assure you there is quite as much of that going on in the country as in the town. Everybody was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at her for a moment, turned silently away. Mrs. Bennet, who fancied she had gained a complete victory over him, continued her triumph. I cannot see that London has any great advantage over the country for my part, except the shops and public places. The country is a vast deal pleasanter, is it not, Mr. Bingley? When I am in the country, he replied, I never wish to leave it, and when I am in town, it is pretty much the same. They have each their advantages, and I can be equally happy in either. Aye, that is because you have the right disposition, but that gentleman, looking at Darcy, seemed to think the country was nothing at all. Indeed, mamma, you are mistaken, said Elizabeth, blushing for her mother. You quite mistook Mr. Darcy. He only meant that there were not such a variety of people to be met with in the country as in the town. Which you must acknowledge to be true. Certainly, my dear, nobody said there were. But as to not meeting with many people in this neighborhood, I believe there are few neighborhoods larger. I know we dine with 24 families. Nothing but concern for Elizabeth could enable Bingley to keep his countenance. His sister was less delicate, and directed her eye toward Mr. Darcy with a very expressive smile. Elizabeth, for the sake of saying something that might turn her mother's thoughts, now asked if Charlotte Lucas had been at Longbourn since her coming away. Yes, she called today with her father. What an agreeable man Sir William is, Mr. Bingley, is he not? So much the man of fashion. So genteel and so easy. He has always something to say to everybody. That is my idea of good breeding, and those persons who fancy themselves very important and never open their mouths quite mistake the matter. Going to town. Did Charlotte dine with you? No, she would go home. I fancy she was wanted about the mince pies. For my part, Mr. Bingley, I always keep servants that can do their own work. My daughters are brought up differently, but everybody is to judge for themselves, and the Lucases are very good sort of girls. I assure you, it is a pity that they are not handsome. Right, for gossip. Not that I think Charlotte so very plain, but then she is our particular friend. She seems a very pleasant young woman, said Bingley. Oh, dear, yes. You must, but you must own she's very plain. Lady Lucas herself has often said so, and envied me Jane's beauty. I do not like to boast of my own child, but to be sure, Jane, one does not often see anybody better looking. It is what everybody says. I do not trust my own partiality. When she was only 15, there was a gentleman at my brother's gardener's in town. At my brother Gardener. There was a gentleman at my brother Gardener's in town. That's your brother's name, Gardner. So much in love with her that my sister-in-law was sure he would make her an offer before we came away. But, however, he did not. Perhaps he thought her too young. However, he wrote some verses on her, and very pretty they were. And so ended his affection, said Elizabeth impatiently. There has been many a one, I fancy, overcome in the same way. I wonder who first discovered the efficacy of poetry in driving away love. I have been used to consider poetry as the food of love, said Darcy. Well, Mr. Darcy's liking the poetry. Food of love, poetry. Of a fine, stout, healthy love it may. Everything nourishes what is strong already, but if it be only a slight, thin sort of inclination, I am convinced that one good sonnet will starve it entirely away. Yeah. A good amount of poetry is good. Too much, like a sonnet, what is that, 16 lines, is just, okay, gag me with a spoon. Too much. It's overkill. Darcy only smiled, and the general pause which ensued made Elizabeth tremble lest her mother should be exposing herself again. She longed to speak, but could think of nothing to say, and after a short silence, Mrs. Bennet began repeating her thanks to Mr. Bingley for his kindness to Jane, with an apology for troubling him also with Lizzie. Mr. Bingley was unaffectedly civil in his answer, and forced his younger sister to be civil also, and say what the occasion required. She performed her part indeed without much graciousness, but Mrs. Bennet was satisfied, and soon afterwards ordered her carriage. Upon this signal, the youngest of her daughters put herself forward. The two girls had been whispering to each other during the whole visit. The result of it was that the youngest should tax Mr. Bingley with having promised on his first coming into the country to give a ball at Netherfield. Lydia was a stout, well-grown girl of 15. With a fine complexion and good-humored countenance, a favorite with her mother, whose affection had brought her into public at an early age. She had high animal spirits and a sort of natural self-consequence, which the attentions of the officers, to whom her uncle's good dinners and her own easy manners recommended her, had increased into assurance. She was very equal, therefore, to address Mr. Bingley on the subject of the ball, and abruptly reminded him of his promise, adding that it would be the most shameful thing in the world if he did not keep it. His answer to this sudden attack was delightful to their mother's ears. I am perfectly ready, I assure you, to keep my engagement. And when your sister is recovered, you shall, if you please, name the very day of the ball. But you would not wish to be dancing while she is ill. Lydia declared herself satisfied. Oh yes, it would be much better to wait till Jane was well, and by that time most likely Captain Carter would be at Meryton again. And when you have given your ball, she added, I shall insist on their giving one also. I shall tell Colonel Forster it will be quite a shame if he does not. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters then departed, and Elizabeth returned instantly to Jane, leaving her own and her relations' behavior to the remarks of the two ladies and Mr. Darcy, the latter of whom Mr. Darcy, however, could not be prevailed on to join in their censure of her, in spite of all Mrs. Bingley's witticisms on fine eyes. So, okay, I'll leave it there. I'll recapitulate to myself later. Moving on to chapter 10 to conclude the 10 chapters of 61. I've got 51 to go after this one. Woe is me. Chapter 10. The day passed much as the day had before. Mrs. Hurst and Mrs. Bingley had spent some hours of the morning with the invalid. Good Lord. What? I'm doing homework. I'm doing homework. I'm doing homework for tomorrow. What do you want, Mom? I will. Oh, chapters 11 through 20 downstairs. The day passed much as the day before had done. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley had spent some hours in the morning with the who continued, though slowly, to mend, and in the evening Elizabeth joined their party in the drawing room. The loo table, however, did not appear. Mr. Darcy was writing, and Miss Bingley, seated near him, was watching the progress of his letter, and repeatedly calling off his attention by messages to his sister. Mr. Hurst and Mr. Bingley were at piquet, and Mrs. Hurst was observing their game. Elizabeth took up some needlework and was sufficiently amused in attending to what passed between Darcy and his companion. The perpetual commendations of the lady either on his handwriting or on the evenness of his lines or on the length of his letter, with the perfect unconcern with which her praises were received, formed a curious dialogue and was exactly in unison with her opinion of each. How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter. He made no answer. You write uncommonly fast. You are mistaken. I write rather slowly. How many letters you must have occasion to write in the course of the year? Letters of business, too. How odious I should think them. It is fortunate, then, that they fall to my lot instead of to yours. Pray tell your sister that I long to see her. I have already told her so once by your desire. I am afraid you do not like your pen. Let me mend it for you. I mend pens remarkably well. Thank you, but I always mend my own. How can you contrive to write so even? He was silent. Tell your sister I am delighted to hear of her improvement on the harp, and pray let her know that I am quite in raptures with her beautiful little design for a table, infinitely superior to Miss Grantley's. Will you give me leave to defer your raptures till I write again? At present I have not room to do them justice. Oh, it is of no consequence. I shall see her in January. But do you always write such charming long letters to her, Mr. Darcy? They are generally long, but whether always charming, it is not for me to determine. It is a rule with me that a person who can write a long letter with ease cannot write ill. That will not do for a compliment to Darcy, Caroline, cried her brother, because he does not write with ease. He studies too much for words of 4 syllables, do you not, Darcy? My style of writing is very different from yours. Oh, cried Miss Bingley, Charles writes in the most careless way imaginable. He leaves out half of his words and blots the rest. My ideas flow so rapidly that I have not time to express them, by which means my letters sometimes convey no ideas at all to my correspondents. Your humility, Mr. Bingley, said Elizabeth, must disarm reproof. Nothing is more deceitful, said Darcy, than the appearance of humility. It is often only carelessness of opinion, and sometimes an indirect boast. And which of the two do you call my little recent piece of modesty? The indirect boast, for you are really proud of your defects in writing, because you consider them as proceeding from a rapidity of thought and carelessness of execution, which, if not estimable, you think at least highly interesting. The power of doing anything with quickness is always much prized by the possessor, and often without any attention to the imperfection of the performance. When you told Mrs. Bennet that this morning that if you ever resolved on quitting Netherfield you should be gone in 5 minutes, you meant it to be a sort of panegyric. Of compliment to yourself. And yet, what is there so very laudable in precipitance which must leave very necessary business undone, and can be of no real advantage to yourself or anyone else? Nay, cried Bingley, this is too much, and to remember at night all the foolish things that were said in the morning, and yet upon my honour I believed what I said of myself to be true, and I believe it at this moment. At least, therefore, I did not assume the character of needless precipitance merely to shew off before the ladies. I dare say you believed it, but I am by no means convinced that you would be gone with such celerity. I've heard of that before. Your conduct would be quite as dependent on chance as that of any man I know, and if, as you were mounting your horse, a friend were to say, Bingley, you had better stay till next week, you'd probably do it. You would probably not go, and at another word might stay a month. You have only proved by this, cried Elizabeth, that Mr. Bingley did not do justice to his own disposition. You have shewn him off now much more than he did himself. I am exceedingly gratified, said Bingley, by your converting what my friend says into a compliment on the sweetness of my temper. But I am afraid you are giving it a turn which that gentleman did by no means intend, for he would certainly think the better of me, if under such circumstance I were to give a flat denial and ride off as fast as I could. Would Mr. Darcy then consider the rashness of your original intention as atoned for by your obstinacy in adhering to it? Upon my word, I cannot exactly explain the matter. Darcy must speak for himself. You expect me to account for opinions which you choose to call acknowledged? Allowing the case, however, to stand according to your representation, you must remember, Miss Bennet, that the friend who is supposed to desire his return to the house, and the delay of his plan, has merely desired it, without offering one argument in favor of his propriety. To yield readily, easily, to the persuasion of a friend is no merit with you. To yield without conviction is no compliment to the understanding of either. You appear to me, Mr. Darcy, to allow nothing for the influence of friendship and affection. A regard for the requester would often make one yield readily to a request, without waiting for arguments to reason one into it. I am not particularly speaking of such a case as you have supposed about Mr. Bingley. We may as well wait, perhaps, till the circumstance occurs, before we discuss the discretion of his behavior thereupon. But in general and ordinary cases between friend and friend, where one of them is desired by the other to change a resolution of no very great moment, should you think ill of that person for complying with the desire without waiting to be argued into it, will it not be advisable, before we proceed on this subject, to arrange with rather more precision than degree of importance, which is to be appertain, which is to appertain to this request, as well as the degree of intimacy subsisting between the parties? By all means, cried Bingley, let us hear all the particulars, not forgetting their comparative height and weight, height and size, for that will have more weight in the argument. Miss Bennet, then you may be aware of. I read that wrong. For that will have more weight in the argument, Miss Bennet, than you may be aware of. I assure you that if Darcy were not such a great tall fellow, in comparison with myself, I should not pay him half so much deference. I declare I do not know a more awful object than Darcy, on particular occasions, and in particular places, at his own house especially, and of a Sunday evening when he has nothing to do. Mr. Darcy smiled, but Elizabeth thought she could perceive he was rather offended, and therefore checked her laugh. Miss Bingley warmly resented the indignity he had received in an expostulation with her brother for talking such nonsense. I see your design, Bingley, said his friend. You dislike an argument and want to silence this. Perhaps I do. Arguments are too much like disputes. If you and Miss Bennet, will defer yours till I am out of the room, I shall be very thankful, and then you may say whatever you like of me. What you ask, said Elizabeth, is no sacrifice on my side, and Mr. Darcy had much better finish his letter. Mr. Darcy took her advice and did finish his letter. When that business was over, he applied to Miss Bingley and Elizabeth for the indulgence of some music. Miss Bingley moved with alacrity to the pianoforte, and after a polite request that Elizabeth would lead the way, with the other, as politely and more earnestly negatived, she seated herself. Mrs. Hurst sang with her sister, and while they were thus employed, Elizabeth could not help observing as she turned over some music books that lay on the instrument how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. She hardly knew how to suppose that she could be an object of admiration to so great a man, and yet that he should look at her because he disliked her was still more strange. She could only imagine, however, at last, that she drew his notice because there was something about her more wrong and reprehensible, according to his ideas of right, than in any other person present. The supposition did not pain her. She liked him too little to care for his approbation. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley varied the charm by lively Scotch air, and soon afterwards Mr. Darcy, drawing near Elizabeth, said to her, Do not you feel a great inclination, Miss Bennet, to seize such an opportunity of dancing a reel? She smiled, but made no answer. He repeated the question with some surprise at her silence. Oh, she said, I heard you before, but I could not immediately determine what to say in reply. You wanted me, I know, to say yes, that you might have the pleasure of despising my taste, but I always delight in overthrowing those kind of schemes and cheating a person of their premeditated contempt. I have therefore made up my mind to tell you that I do not want to dance a reel at all. And now despise me if you dare. Indeed, I do not dare. Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry. But there was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner, which made it difficult for her to affront anybody, and Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. He really believed that were it not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger. Miss Bingley saw, or suspected enough to be jealous, and her great anxiety for the recovery of her dear friend Jane received some assistance from her desire of getting rid of Elizabeth. She often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking her guest by talking of their supposed marriage, and planning his happiness in such an alliance. I hope, she said as they were walking together in the shrubbery the next day, you will give the mother-in-law a few hints when this desirable event takes place, as to the advantage of holding her, and if you can compass it, do cure the younger girls of running after the officers. And I may mention so delicate a subject, if I may mention so delicate a subject, endeavor to check that little something bordering on conceit and impertinence which your lady possesses. Have you anything else to propose for my domestic felicity? Oh yes, do let the portraits of your uncle and Aunt Phillips. Aunt Phillips? Uncle and Aunt Phillips. Be placed in the gallery at Pemberley. Put them next to your great-uncle, the judge. They are in the same profession, you know, only in different lines. As for your Elizabeth's picture, you must not attempt to have it taken, for what painter could do justice to those beautiful eyes? It would not be easy, indeed, to catch their expression, but their color and shape and the eyelashes, so remarkably fine, might be copied. At that moment they were met from another walk by Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth herself. I did not know that you intended to walk, said Miss Bingley, in some confusion, lest they had been overheard. You used us abominably ill, answered Mrs. Hurst, in running away without telling us that you were coming out. Then, taking the disengaged arm of Mr. Darcy, she left Elizabeth to walk by herself. The path just admitted 3. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness and immediately said, "This walk is not wide enough for our party. We had better go into the avenue." But Elizabeth, who had not the least inclination to remain with them, laughingly answered, "Where you are charmingly grouped and appear to uncommon advantage. Picturesque would be spoilt by admitting a fourth. Goodbye." She then ran gaily off, rejoicing as she rambled about, in the hope of being at home again in a day or two. Jane was already so much recovered as to intend leaving her room for a couple of hours that evening. Conclusion of chapter 10. So 9 and 10 I will recapitulate to myself, and that is the first 10 chapters of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I apologize for the interruptions. If anyone is listening to this book devoutly, I apologize. Mucha tremendioso mente. And now I take leave of you to go to the bathroom, to pass my water, and to attend to my mother, where she wants me in the lower level, in the front room, to study down there. You know, she's just going to tell me, "Stop studying down here. Go back to your room." I love my mother, Rucha Brande. Thanks again, and I'll see you for chapters 11 through 20. I hope. I pray to God. If I can't do but 5, I'm gonna like speed through them, you know, and all that and whatnot. And whoever knocks, I gotta write a 1-page response paper on this, and I don't want to stay at it all night. For I have other homework to do in computer science. And cruising the internet. Just kidding. No, I'm not. Okay. Thank you. We'll see you. Bye.